in our latest Silmarillion chat, we're actually into the Quenta Silmarillion itself, the main book within the book. There's two short sections beforehand, and there's two slightly longer sections afterward. But the main bulk of this, some 220 pages, is the Quenta Silmarillion, which is the story of the Silmarils, these jewels which contain the light of the two trees of Valinor, and there's a great tale and saga to do with them. And what we did in the Discord and the buddy read I'm leading, we did the first 4 chapters of the beginning of days of Aule and Yavanna, of the coming of the Elves and the captivity of Melkor, and of Thingol and Melian. This was, I don't know if I'd say it's a pleasant surprise. I have fond memories of my last read of the Silmarillion, but I definitely enjoyed reading it. There's an interesting tonal development where we begin to move from a very, very high style, and the high style is always there, and I'll touch on this in a moment, but this very high style into, which is very much mythological in terms of it saying this is the tale of the gods and the angels and the whatever, and the creation of the earth, and that continues in the first couple of chapters here, and then we transition into a slightly more, let's call it an epic tone. It's the Iliad rather than the hymns of Homer. The first 2 chapters are chiefly, not literally wholly, but chiefly about the Valar. The first we have, we hear the tale of the coming of Tulkas, the war god, I guess you could say, the wrestler god. You can see the first creation, the first world that they create. I mean, there's only ever one world, there's Arda, but the first version of Arda, the Spring of Arda it's later called, where there are these 2 lamps that light everything in a kind of soft focus light, and they're beginning to see plants grow, and Yavanna particularly is emphasised here. And there's then there's a great feast, and Manwë ordains a great feast, but Aule and Tulkas were weary for the craft of Aule, and the strength of Tulkas had been at the service of all without ceasing in the days of their labour. And Melkor knew of all that was done, for even then he had secret friends and spies among the Maiar whom he had converted to his cause. That's a significant point, actually, which I'll return to. But yeah, then there's another war, and the particular point here is that the Spring of Arda ends, the world is damaged, wrecked, smashed, and the reason the Valar don't defeat Melkor then is because they're spending so much time salvaging what they can of the world. And this is sad. This is the first grand defeat of the long defeat in Tolkienian terms. The first thing where what was good is destroyed and people have to pick up the pieces. And then the Valar depart from Middle-earth and go to the westernmost land, and they stay there, and they raise mountains, and they do Tanaquil, the great mountain, where Manwë has his throne, which is, we've actually already heard in the Valar Quenta of that really as the place where the Valar live. There's an interesting point here that in the and this comes to this idea of disaster, catastrophe, and what Tolkien would call eucatastrophe, good catastrophe. In the guarded land, the Valar gathered great store of light in all the fairest things that were saved from the ruin, and many others yet fairer they made anew, and Valinor became more beautiful even than Middle-earth in the Spring of Arda. And there's, I think, even within the same chapters we've read, I think there might be one more mention of something like that. The idea that even though much is lost, this is Tennyson, much is lost yet much remains, actually on the note of epic, that's the poem Ulysses. Much is lost yet much remains, and the point is actually it's that the things that remain have gained by the experience, by the loss, and they have become more beautiful and precious, and you see this in Lord of the Rings with Galadriel particularly. Then there are, and this is a very significant point, this is one of the most important thematic points and plot points in the whole of Middle-earth, that Yavanna raises 2 shoots. Well, what happens is Yavanna hallows the mound before the gate to the home of the Valar, and she sat there long upon the green grass, sang a song of power. Nienna thought in silence and watered the mound with tears. And as they watched, there came forth 2 slender shoots, and silence was over all the world in that hour, nor was there any other sound save the chanting of Yavanna. These were the 2 trees of Valinor, which are Telperion and Laurelin, the silver and the gold. And these kind of magic trees, basically, of light, one like the sun, one like the moon, and they create the first day cycles, these 12-hour cycles, where each of them being up for, is it 7 hours or whatever, but yeah, waxing and waning with each other, just like the sun and the moon later will. And that begins the count of days. We then, the other fairly short Valar tale is of Aule and Yavanna, and of their creations, and this actually touches on Manwë too, and we find Aule wants to do something good. He loves the idea of the fact that Ilúvatar has these children he's making. The Valar don't know anything about him. He's like, that's amazing. So he makes his own dwarves, and then Ilúvatar finds this out, and Aule volunteers to destroy them. Aule is not Melkor. Aule is always, he always understands he doesn't know everything, and that someone else, particularly Eru, might know better. But Eru says, no, in fact, I'm going to improve this thing. Though they have to wait till my children awake, I'm going to improve this by giving them real life, real souls. So the dwarves become a sort of child of Ilúvatar too in that way, don't they? Because they gain something which only Ilúvatar can give. It turns out Aule cannot give, and this is significant for how orcs come about, which comes up in this section too. Then you have Yavanna say, well, what about all my stuff? These dwarves are going to all chop up. So you get the tree shepherds, you get the Ents, and then you get the great eagles, who are Manwë's Ents or dwarves. They are 3 intelligent species, races, whatever you want to call them, in Middle-earth, who are not the children of Ilúvatar, and explain. But we know what they are. They all have to have souls from Ilúvatar, basically, if you want to use that terminology. But yeah, this is a key thing about the idea of ultimate life coming from the god of Middle-earth, and the high angels not being able to do the same thing. And that's a nice story. I think we quite liked. There's a lot of chat in our discussion about Aule and Yavanna, and that idea, a difference between Aule and Melkor that's drawn out. I think Clark is bringing this up, was the idea that Aule has a relationship of love with his creatures and with Eru, whereas Melkor only has this relationship of corruption and power and fear. And that is a key Tolkienian category, I think. You know, the nature of power, the nature of... Remember, there was a kind of slightly anarchistic politic in Tolkien in a way that's not always appreciated, I think, by all kinds of people. But where basically... And you see it's best in the Shire, where you have 2 aristocratic lords and a mayor who rule the whole place, but it's not clear what power they have or how they can make anyone do anything. There's sort of people with legal power, the postman, pretty much. But really, it all trades on relationship, and you see the same with the way that Aragorn Elessar seeks to rule in Gondor, and how he seeks to lead the party. In fact, the company. We then, and this is a very significant thing, though the Valar are important, and there's another chapter here that importantly involves, well, both chapters remaining involve the Valar, but one really involves the Valar in a very long-term significant way. We now shift to the real main characters of the Silmarillion. So by chapter 3, we've moved from the Valar being the main characters, well, Eru and the Valar in the Ainul and Dale, the Valar and the Valaquenta, and then the Valar mostly in the first 2 chapters of the Quenta Silmarillion, And now we move to the coming of the elves, the captivity of Melkor, and basically that it's time for the first of the children of Ilúvatar to awaken, the elves, and they awaken, and Melkor controls much of the earth, because in that first war in the Spring of Arda, he's escaped to his fortress at Autumno, and he makes a fortress called Angband, commanded by Sauron. And there's an interesting point. This is what I was going to bring up. At the start of chapter 3, we hear that those who'd been with him longest, he gathered his demons about him, these spirits who first adhered to him in the days of his splendour and became most like him in his corruption. Their hearts were of fire, but they were cloaked in darkness, and terror went before them. They had whips of flame. Balrogs, they were named in Middle-earth in later days. The Balrogs are the first, I forget their other name, I think it's in the Valar Quenta. I assume it's a Quenya name. But I want to know this. Yeah, they are called the... Come on. Yeah, the point is that they are his first servants. They're those most like him. They're maybe the mire of his legion, or whatever you want to call them. They're Valarokar, that's it. But here's an important, interesting thing to me, and it'll come up later with what Sauron's powers are, but that Sauron is the lieutenant of Angband. But he is not a Balrog. He is apparently not one of the first and most powerful of his servants. He may be perhaps one of those Maiar who stayed within the camp and betrayed the Valar in the Spring of Arda, which will hark forward to him as a Tanatar, giver of gifts, and as the prisoner of the kings of Númenor, of Ar-Pharazôn particularly. This smooth-tongued, sometimes almost self-convincingly good guy who just keeps betraying people. Then Yavanna and Arome is the hunt god. They're going out, and they think that it's time to go and find the children of Ilúvatar. Shall they call Melkor lord while Manwë sits upon Tanaquil? And Torquus cried, "Nay, let us make war swiftly," because Torquus always wants to have a fight. Mandos speaks and says that they will always, great light shall be for their waning. To Varda ever shall they call it neither. Elbereth, they'll always love the stars most. And Varda sets the stars in the sky. So you're still getting creation myth stuff, but we're beginning to move towards, as I say, the main characters. Some of the Quendi, the singers, are scared, but most follow them, and they from Cuivianen. But we do hear that some of those who, I think this is before they're brought away from the Cuivianen, but Melkor kidnaps some, corrupts them, and in some way creates orcs out of them. Whether that's because elves become orcs, or whether there's some horrendous industry and genetic engineering going on, and I think there's some question or dispute about two things. One, does this mean that Melkor, can he create life because he creates orcs? The answer from this text would seem to be no. He's relying on the same principle of gaining a soul, stealing souls essentially, and the power of generation from Ilúvatar, because he can create nothing new. He creates new parodies, and so the life and generative power in orcs is something stolen from corrupting elves, much like Aule's dwarves got free will and intellect from Ilúvatar, not from Aule. It's interesting, this is one of those things where Tolkien, much like with the issue of the cosmography and flat earth aspect of Middle-earth, later on in Tolkien's life, towards the end, he seemed to be reconsidering some of that for various reasons, and I think those are separate cases for him. But the version we have is based on the final coherent versions from, both the 30s right and then the early 50s right, with some rewrites from the late 50s. I think Valar Quenta, for instance, is a late 50s product. And so here, this is the last coherent version we've got, and in this we have it is a coherent anthropology, if you want to call it that, or psychology, where will is metaphysical. It's not physical, it's something that has to come from outside into the created being. Arome, there's one thing that they fear Arome because Melkor has said, oh, by the way, there's this evil spirit, or rather he's tricked them, he's not said to them, he's depicted to them and deluded them about an evil spirit riding a stag. But no, it turns out, or a horse, and it turns out they come to like Arome, and Arome leads them on, and Iluvatar tells Manwë that the Valar should take over Earth again, basically, and rule it and go and defeat Melkor. Tulkas is very pleased. Aule is not pleased. One thing I noticed, by the way, is the number of people that Melkor has like grief with, that he just is bitter against. Oh, Manwë, because they're co-equal at some level. Oh no, but also Aule, because they're both creators. Also Arome, because Arome wanders around Middle-earth and finds out stuff. Also Varda, because she's the starlight. Also Tulkas. He's that guy who is a very reasonable, nice guy, but he just, no, he doesn't wish anyone harm, but he just has a problem with literally everyone. They do break and destroy a Tumno in this war, and Tulkas wrestles him down and chains him with the chain Angainor. And nonetheless, many of his lieutenants escape, and they, Sauron particularly, and that is why Angband is later his fortress, because a Tumno in the far north is destroyed, far north and east, whereas this northwestern fortress at Angband remains, presumably with Sauron. The Valar call... There's a debate, should the elves stay in Middle-earth because it's all been wrecked, or should they come and live with the Valar? And they come and live with the Valar. And Mandos does, well, or his comment is, so it is doomed. From this summons, this is not in speech quotes, came many woes that afterwards befell. The Valar make an imperfect decision, much like Aule. It's interesting here, these are not necessarily like angels in Judeo-Christian or Persian mythology, where angels are, if they're good angels, they're just good. They are good, to be clear, but the Valar make mistakes. Aule makes the dwarves without permission, and he has to repent of that decision. The Valar, under Manwë's ultimate authority, against Ulmo being the Valar who represents the other side, they call them to come to Aman to live with them, and so there's this disaster that comes upon them, and that leads to the continuing jealousies of what is relevant to do with how Melkor becomes free eventually, and how therefore the two trees are destroyed, and how therefore the elves, because the Silmarils carry the light, the Noldor end up rebelling and going back over to Middle-earth, and all the disasters that come from that. But also, because this is Tolkien, of course, the many eucatastrophes, good disasters, because it's because of all that to take just one instance, you have Galadriel at the end of the Third Age, able to aid the ring bearers on the Company of the Ring on their path to destroy the ring, and therefore finally break the power of Sauron, who even at this early point is a pain. There are three kings of the elves, Ingwe, Finwë and Elwë, who afterward were kings. An interesting point, and that they get to see, they are taken magically by Arome to Valinor. They love it, they go back. It's notable and important that Elwë is the king here, and that Elwë has seen the light of Valinor. But some people don't want to come. The kindred of Ingwe and most part of the kindreds of Finwë and Elwë wanted to follow them, and they were known as the Eldar, but the others, the Avari, the unwilling, left behind, and they met never again until many ages were past. And then Ingwe arrives, then with his Vanyar, the fair elves, beloved of Manwë and Varda. Next came the Noldor, a name of wisdom, the people of Finwë, the deep elves, the friends of Aule. An interesting thing, it certainly points towards what will later be Celebrimbor's friendship with the dwarves, Atiregion, and generally that kind of craftiness. But it's interesting, of course, that doesn't mean, and I mean they're friends with dwarves in the first age too, but the fact that the Noldor are often the ruling class of elves in the West, not in the West, in Western Middle-earth, but still don't always get on with dwarves. You'd think they should, given they're both, if you like, the children of Aule, or one is the child and one is the beloved nephew. And then the greatest host, the Teleri, because they tarried on the road, they were not wholly of a mind to pass from the dusk to the light of Valinor. In water they had great delight. The sea elves they became in the land of Aman, the Falmari. 2 lords they had, because their number was great, Elwe Singolo, i.e. Grey Mantle, and Olwe his brother. And a key thing that emerges here, you get a few things. You get Lenwe of the host of Olwe leading many into the trees. They don't go to the coast. They don't love the coasts. They love waterfalls and water, but they really love to stay not in the sea, which scares them, but in the trees. And they're going to become what various forms of Sylvan Elf. Denethor, his son, that name for the first time, will bring many of them into Beleriand. But Elwë is going to go missing, and this leaves Elwë in charge, but it means that many of Elwë's kinfolk also stay behind in Middle-earth. So you have this quite interesting migratory pattern, which I think Tolkien would have been basing on, I guess, things like the Great Barbarian migrations of the ancient world, of the early ancient world, of the late Roman period, well, indeed, the whole Roman period, from the Gallic migrations all the way up to the Huns, and then later migrations with the Pechenegs and Avars and Cumans and indeed the Mongols, rather more dramatically. This idea that you have these many migrations from the east into the west, and you have splitting that makes ethnographic sense of this. Because he's a linguist, and to be a linguist means partly to be an ethnographer, so he's like, okay, so these cultural traditions and these things that happen due to this. There are some who stay by Anduin the Great, and they wish to remain there because they really just loved. They loved water, but they didn't want the sea, and they wanted instead. And this will come up again, actually, they wanted the trees. So you explain where that ethnic group comes from, and it's going to become relevant that later they and the Sindar, their cousins, are united functionally in the Third Age with the Sindar as their princes. And there's a big thing here about the closer to the light of Valinor people come, longer term, the stronger they are. And this is particularly relevant with Thingol and Melian. Thingol being, well, Elwë Singolo becomes, in the mutated language, Ilu Thingol, and his people stay there in Beleriand, and he becomes lost in a wood, the Wood of the Nightingale, where he meets an angel, literally. And Melian, via Melian, this is another difference from some of the angels of mythology. It turns out that Maiar can breed with elves. They are, whether that's magically, mystically, or biologically compatible. I guess I'd probably think at some level the former. They're mythologically compatible. But it means that, therefore, Aragorn and Elrond, because they're descended eventually, via Luthien to Beren and Luthien to Melian the Maiar, they are part angel. And Elrond, particularly close to that, actually, he's a great grandchild or something like that. So you again have another splitting, but it's important. It's Elwë who is left behind, not Olwë, because Elwë has already seen Valinor. He is the only Sindar to have done that, and it does make the point that his people are called Grey Elves, the Elves of the Twilight, and King Grey Mantle was he. He was considered great power Melian lent to Thingol, who was himself great among the Eldar, for he alone of all the Sindar had seen with his own eyes the trees in the day of their flowering, and king though he was of Emanyar, he was not accounted among the Morrikendi, but with the Elves of the Light mighty upon Middle-earth. The light of the trees gives power. And that's something which, for instance, later, Elrond and who's the other person I'm thinking of? Elrond or Legolas, who are Noldor and Sindar respectively, neither sees the light of the trees. They're powerful, but neither sees the light of the trees, and so they will never have had the same powerful experience. They will, when they return to the West, they're not returning, they've never been there, but in spiritually returning to the West, it will not be the West, and we'll discover this as we go on. It will not be the West of the light of the two trees, really the summer of Arda, if you like, or at least the summer of Valinor, this high point of power and beauty. Of the love of Thingol and Melian there came into the world the fairest of all the children of Ilúvatar that was or ever shall be. We're getting a big kind of legendary status established there. So you can see we've got Melian, who's a Maya, who's an angel, established. We know Sauron's important because he can't be found. But we are transferring from the world strictly of angels into, in Silmarillion terms, a more everyday world of elves, except that everything about the elves is mythological and high and mighty. They only ever feel things strongly. We'll discover that. They are... And you see this with the human species, i.e. the elves, humans and halflings, hobbits. There is I wouldn't say a decline, but there is a shift, isn't there, with the elves, who are just these almost creatures of pure something, entirely hardcore about whatever they're doing, to humans who are more mixed, who are tempted. And that's one thing. Elves don't, in that sense, the elves we meet don't fall to evil in the way that they go and serve the enemy. Nor do the dwarves, of course, in that way. We'll find out when the Sons of Feanor are doing bad things, it's not because they want to serve Melkor. Suffice to say. Humans can. Hobbits are another shift or change again, aren't they? But they're the same archetype, the same, I guess, genotype, but different phenotype. They've got this thing going on where they are much more ordinary and everyday, and the tales that go with each of them is framed accordingly by Tolkien. And maybe that's my last point, is the tone has shifted from very high mythological into more epic or biblical history. Your Homer, your Book of Joshua stuff of these peoples going out and doing things and the legends of particular heroes. And that's very different to not just The Hobbit, but also Rings, because Rings is very much a novel. And the Quenta is not a novel in that way. By that, I mean it doesn't have a very close relationship to the ordinary patterns of narrative fiction of the 17th, 18th century onwards. It is prehistory. And I think one of the adaptations you've got to make is to recognise that. And then once you recognise that, you can enjoy that style more. Anyway, that's my thoughts and some of the thoughts people expressed on the Discord. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this section and about this movement into a more epic, heroic tale from being a mythological one. Share some of that stuff in the comments. Till next time.